think, say, Cenk Uygur's personality is wildly different than Jimmy Dore's or Kyle Kulinski. I don't think it's so much personality. I think it's a genuine divergence of how to do politics and ideology. I think that camp, kind of the Majority Report and Sam Cedar and those kind of people, they'll criticize the Democratic Party, but at the end of their day, their politics is inextricably linked to the Democratic Party. And if yours isn't, they regard you as less of an ally than, say, Nancy Pelosi or Chuck Schumer, because those are the people who they're in bed with. So I think the differences are more substantive than personality driven.
So another issue that has emerged during this TYT feud is the fact that Jeffrey Katzenberg and others invested $20 million into TYT several years ago. And Jimmy Dore has brought this up a couple of times, suggesting that TYT's opinions have changed on a couple issues. In fact, when he was on this show, he actually brought up the fact that there was discussion about TYT changing their positions while he was still there.
So, and then it was like a year later that executive at the TYT told me that they have to move towards the center. And so I didn't know.
Can you just share any more details about that specifically? Like, what was that conversation like, and just how was that framed exactly?
I was saying the same shit. I'm like, well, if he's taking money from these people, how is it not going to affect it? It's obviously going to affect, right? And he goes, well, we have to move towards the center. We know that. That's a direct quote. So, and I don't want to say who that was, I mean, Ben Mankiewicz was one of my best friends over there. I had a lot of good friends. I don't want to say who said it. But that was said. And then and when I saw them smear Julian Assange, I was like, oh, they're doing this. They're signaling to a donor. You could tell Cenk didn't even believe what he was saying, just like they don't believe what they're saying about Aaron Matei, just like they don't believe what they're saying about me, just like they don't believe what they're saying about Syria. You could tell in their face, they don't believe it. And he didn't believe. Cenk was just like, oh, I have to do this because he's signaling to a donor.
And I think that we saw this most pronounced recently in June when Anna Kasparian started mentioning that she is in favor of anti-camping laws.
I do think that there are progressives, I don't know if it's progressive policy, but progressives in places like California who have made terrible decisions. And so one of those terrible decisions is essentially doing away with anti-camping laws, right? Allowing people to camp out wherever they want, whenever they want. And if, like, we have a homeless problem in California, we have it all throughout the country, but it's particularly bad in California. And so the argument is, well, if there isn't public housing available for people, they should be allowed to camp out. Okay, but there's also a problem right now where there is public housing available and individuals will say, no, I don't want to take it. I don't want to follow the rules in the public housing. And so as a result, I would rather camp out. Progressive lawmakers are like, we should allow them to camp out. And you know what happens? Crime happens. Open air drug markets happen, and it's the truth. These are the facts of the matter. In fact, it was addressed in this Daily Beast article, and honestly, it was cathartic to read it because everyone denies that this is happening.
And this was happening as Jeffrey Katzenberg was lobbying to criminalize homelessness. So just based on that alone, it appears as though there must be some tangential sort of influence on TYT's talking points, at least for the fact that they didn't bring anyone on with an alternative perspective to speak against that, or they haven't directly mentioned the recent criminalization of homelessness. So I'm just wondering what your take is on that overall. Do you think that $20 million has influenced TYT, or do you think that they would espouse many of the same views regardless?
Honestly, I don't know Cenk and Anna well enough, especially these days, to be able to say with any degree of confidence what their motivations are about why they do particular things or take certain positions. So let me just talk generally about this question, about whether people are motivated to think differently or advocate differently in order to appease or accommodate those on whom they're financially dependent, their funders. I think it's very difficult in general to know other people's motives. And I also think it's a rare person who consciously decides that they're going to advocate things they don't really believe because they know that their funder wants them to. Like that level of ethical corruption, when expressed that explicitly, is so deep that you almost have to be a sociopath or someone with absolutely zero personal dignity to admit to yourself that you're actually doing that, right? To like do that consciously. Like, I actually have empathy for the homeless, but because I know we got $20 million from Jeffrey Katzenberg and I want maybe another round of investment from him, and I know that the anti-homeless crusade is important, I'm going to go and artificially or falsely pretend that I share that view with him in order to get more money. Like that kind of conscious, explicit corruption, I think, is not common for people. I think what happens is more subtle than that, and I think it happens in one of two ways. And this is actually something that Noam Chomsky has talked a lot about, I think probably in the best way, which is, you know, he's long had a theory that the people who fund media, corporate media, like advertisers and corporations, dictate the content of that media because they're not going to fund media that's contrary to their interest. And when he says that, people who work, you know, employees of media corporations will say, that's absolutely crazy. I can tell you, you know, no one has ever told me what to say. No one has ever come to me and said, hey, I want you to advocate for that war. I want you to, you know, take this position in line with these corporate interests. So you're wrong. Just that doesn't happen. What you're claiming doesn't happen. Funders don't come to you and tell you what to say. Managers don't either. And his answer is, I know that. I'm not suggesting that they do. I'm not saying, and I guess like to use the Katzenberg Young Turks example, since that's the one you asked me about, he would say, I'm not saying that Jeffrey Katzenberg picks up the phone and calls Anna Kasparian and tells her what to say. He doesn't need to do that because, number one, she knows what he wants her to say, right? He doesn't need to tell her, hey, don't stray too far away from Democratic Party politics since I'm a big DNC funder and I believe in the Democratic Party. She knows that he thinks that. And so subliminally or subconsciously, when Cenk and Anna know that they're now being funded by somebody who views the Democratic Party as a really important instrument, subliminally they're going to know that there's limits on what they can say without offending him. But I think the more important dynamic that Chomsky describes is when journalists say to him, no one has ever told me what to say. He'll say to them, look, and there's a famous, I think it was the BBC or the CBC, I don't remember which, but there was a famous interview where a journalist challenged him and said, no one ever tells me what to say. And he said, oh, I don't think that you're being inauthentic at all. I don't think you're saying these things because you don't believe them. What I'm telling you is that if you didn't believe them, you wouldn't be sitting in that seat. Meaning the BBC and the CBC will only hire people who work within a certain narrow range of opinions, and anyone who's a dissident from those orthodoxies would never get a job hosting a CBC or an NBC or an MSNBC or a BBC show. And I think that's, you know, the case for the Young Turks. It's not that the Young Turks changed because Jeffrey Katzenberg invested $20 million in them. I think it's more the fact that Jeffrey Katzenberg chose the Young Turks to invest $20 million in shows you what the Young Turks are, which is a very non-threatening and mainstream voice that's slightly to the left of the center of the Democratic Party, which you absolutely need if you're a believer in Democratic Party power, because it's the AOCs and the Bernie Sanders of the world who convince leftists who are to the left of, say, Nancy Pelosi, that the Democratic Party is still their home. That's what keeps them captive to the Democratic Party is, oh, look, I see Bernie Sanders and AOC there. That's who I identify with. And they're in the Democratic Party, so that's my party. And I think that I don't think it's that the Young Turks once was this radical, subversive platform that became more mainstream once Jeffrey Katzenberg invested in them. I think Jeffrey Katzenberg invested in them because they were never that. They were always, ultimately, at the end of the day, when push comes to shove, when the rubber meets the road, tools of the Democratic Party. And maybe they've become more of that because, like I said, the Trump era drove the left into the arms even more than they ever were before the Democratic Party in unity against what they believe was this fascist threat. But I think the Young Turks are pretty much what they've always been.